Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. IKIM Inspirasi Inforia Islami. You're with me, Mazlina Ismail. Alhamdulillah, this week we return with Man and Nature with our guest, none other but Dr. Dr. Syekh Muhammad Safiuddin bin Syekh Muhammad Saleh. Assalamualaikum, Doctor.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. How are you
How are
today?
you? Alhamdulillah, good. How are
I'm good
you?
too. Alhamdulillah, I'm good.
Good to see you. Alhamdulillah, this week we will be sharing with our listeners or viewers on our next topic, IPCC report on climate change. Perhaps we're going to focus on what does climate change mean for Malaysia. And for your information, Dr. Sheikh Muhammad Saifuddin is Senior Fellow Director, Center for Science and Environment Studies in IKIM. So, inshallah, I'll be sharing on recently the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, released a document called the Sixth Assessment Report on Climate Change 2021. Before we go further into our discussion, inshallah, would you like to enlighten our listeners as to what is the IPCC, Dr. Sheikh?
Right, thank you, Haja Mazlina. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon. Alhamdulillah, we are again on the air in the program Man and Nature. And today, as mentioned by Haja Mazlina, we'll be focusing on the IPCC report on climate change. Maybe some of our listeners may not be aware or may not know what IPCC is. So I'll begin with sharing with everyone that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. The IPCC provides regular assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impacts and future risks, as well as options for adaptation and mitigation. IPCC historically was established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, and the United Nations Environmental Programme, or UNEP. And the objective of IPCC is to provide governments with scientific information that can be used to develop climate policies. Currently, IPCC has 195 members, which also includes our country, Malaysia. And the way IPCC works is that it is divided into 3 working groups and 1 task force. Namely, Working Group 1 deals with the physical science basis of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Working Group 2 deals with climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Working Group 3 deals with mitigation of climate change, and Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories deals with the development and refinement of the methodology and criteria to calculate and report national greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So these are the 4 subcommittees, if you like, under IPCC that work towards coming out with periodic reports. So the first assessment report was published in 1990 and became the basis for negotiations for a framework convention on climate change initiated by the United Nations. The latest report that we are going to highlight today is actually the report from one of the working groups, which is the Working Group 1, which looks at the physical science basis for climate change. So the report is entitled Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis. And this is a part or one part of the 6th assessment report to be released later, after the other 2 working groups released their respective reports in 2022. So inshallah, Haja Mazlina, our focus for today will be on the physical science basis for climate change as reported by the first working group of IPCC.
Mm-hmm. So let's just go on. What does the report say about the current state of the climate, Dr. Sheikh?
Right. I think to put it simply, not very good. But as mentioned earlier, this report is produced by the first working group, which focuses on the physical science aspect of climate change. As such, the data contained in this report are rich with physical science data that are critical in assessing the situation regarding climate change. This report is based on more than 14,000 studies on the physical science of climate change and has been regarded to be the most comprehensive report on climate change from the physical science perspective. So for the benefits of our listeners, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to highlight some of the important points from this report.
Yes, yes.
The first is humans can no longer stop global warming from intensifying over the next 30 years, with the temperature already 1.1 degrees Celsius higher compared to the 19th century. Point number two, the global average temperature will continue to rise by as high as 4 degrees Celsius if we fail to stop carbon emissions from increasing. The third important point, the past decade is the hottest the planet has seen in 125,000 years. And then more than 250 billion tons of carbon dioxide has been released since 2013, the highest level of atmospheric carbon dioxide level in at least 2 million years. We also note from the report that glaciers are melting and receding at an unprecedented rate in the last 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland are destabilizing, risking another 90 centimeters rise of sea level. Oceans have risen by over 20 centimeters on average in the past century, with the rate doubling since 2006. At 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, sea levels are projected to rise between 30 to 60 centimeters this century. Global warming will cause the water cycle to be more intense, leading to heavier rainfall and flooding. And it is projected that daily extreme precipitation events will intensify by 7% for every 1 degree Celsius in global temperature rise. Also, of significance, heat waves will become significantly hotter compared to the past 70 years, and they will last longer. Today, a heat wave can be expected every 10 years on average. And at 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, there will be a hotter heat wave every 5 years. If the average global warming stands at 4 degrees Celsius, heat wave is expected to occur every year. And we also note that bursts of extreme heat in the ocean have doubled in frequency since the 1980s, and this can have effects on fish, seabirds, and also coral reefs. So these are some of the takeaway points that I can highlight as a sharing to our listeners. And all these points, I'm sure, if you think about it, all of them are very scary indeed.
Yes, indeed.
Looks like we are heading into a very bleak future with respects to the climate.
All right. But I'm sure there's a lot of more people who are not aware of the situation. Maybe you can give us a scenario that has been put forth in the report regarding the potential climate futures.
I
Dr. Shah.
think before I answer that question, I think I agree with your point that many people are unaware. I
Yeah.
think we have this syndrome called the frog in the pot syndrome.
Mm.
If you put frogs in a pot and you put in water and you boil the water gradually, they will not
Mm-hmm.
notice any change. So I think that's the predicament that we are in. We are not noticing the change when in fact the change is indeed happening. And if we do not do anything about it, we do not mitigate these changes, it will be very detrimental to the future of our survival.
That's
So
right.
going back to your question, what scenario
Yeah.
has been put forth? Basically, the people involved in the report, they looked at 5 possible scenarios that are assessed in this report. Scenario 1 is when there is a very high level of greenhouse gases emission and
Mm-hmm.
carbon dioxide emission that roughly double from current levels by 2050. Scenario 2 is when levels of greenhouse gases emissions are high and
Mm-hmm.
carbon dioxide emissions roughly double from current levels by 2100. Scenario 3 is the intermediate scenario whereby we have intermediate levels of greenhouse gases emissions and carbon dioxide emissions remaining around current levels until 2050. Scenario 4 is when we see low levels of greenhouse gases emissions and carbon dioxide emissions at a very low level, in fact declining to net zero by the year 2050. And scenario 5 is when we have very low levels of greenhouse gases emissions and carbon dioxide emissions declining to net negative after 2050. So these are the 5 scenarios that are looked at in the report. And of course, the best scenario would be the 5th scenario, when we have a very low level emission of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide emission declining to net negative by 2050. But again, this is something that is very difficult to achieve. Realistically speaking, we are looking at scenario number 1 with very high levels of greenhouse gases emissions, and carbon dioxide emissions will roughly double by the year 2050. And each of these scenarios are given its own impacts in the report, and all these scenarios are assessed to put forward a projection for what the future may look like in each scenario regarding climate change. Like I said, the best is the last scenario. But to achieve that, a lot must be done, not just by us as individuals, but more importantly by the governments. Policies must be in place, and these policies must be translated into actions that can make the necessary changes in order to stop or mitigate the climate change situation that we are facing today.
Yeah. Speaking on the situation that we are facing today, let's come closer to home, which is climate change. What does climate change mean for Malaysia? I mean, climate change
Right.
in our country. Yeah.
Right. I think it's good for us to look at what's in it for Malaysia and what impacts does climate change have on Malaysia. Basically,
Yeah.
global warming, no doubt, global warming will definitely affect our country, even though, as we said earlier, we may not notice this. But the reality is, when temperature rises, we will see a lot of changes taking place. Unlike the global average temperature that exhibits significant increases, the annual average temperature in most of the Southern Asian region, including Malaysia, has been steadily rising in the past century. Malaysia has relatively uniform temperatures throughout the year. That's why I think most of us do not actually notice any significant change. But it is projected by 2050, Malaysia will be hotter by 1.5 degrees Celsius. In terms of rainfall, it is expected that Malaysia will experience more torrential rainfall by the middle of the century. And because of this, we will be experiencing more floodings. In terms of human health, climate change can definitely affect human health through a range of direct and indirect exposures. Events like floods, heat waves, and haze can impact on our health. And not forgetting, we live in a tropical country, and because of this, we have a lot of diseases related to vectors such as mosquitoes. So climate change can also has a direct effect on vector distribution, and consequently diseases such as dengue and other vector-borne diseases. If you look at coastal areas, Malaysia has many coasts around the country, and definitely coastal areas are the most vulnerable to climate change. When we have increased sea levels, this can result in land loss, soil erosion, as well as effects on coral reefs and depletion of fisheries resources. In terms of biodiversity, ecosystems will most definitely be impacted by climate change. Malaysia is one of the mega biodiversity countries. And if we do not look into this, climate change can result in increasing extinction rates, as well as threatening survival of many species. In terms of land cover change, climatic factors actually influences forest health. Forest response to climate change is biologically complex, and the effects are not quickly noticed or quickly observed. However, if you look at mangrove forests, they are the most to be at risk when it comes to climate change, because we find mangroves at coastal areas. As mentioned earlier, coastal areas are very vulnerable to climate change. If you look at crops, Malaysia is also a country that has a lot of agriculture activities. When we have climate change, increased temperature, increased rainfall, floodings, this can do a lot of physical damage. And this can result in loss of crop harvest, drop in productivity, and also we have, for Malaysia, I think this will definitely impact on the agricultural sector. So these are some of the changes or impacts that we have to expect in terms of climate change, especially if we don't do anything constructive
Mm-hmm.
to minimize or to mitigate the impact of the changes that we are seeing today.
Right, indeed, it is worrying. But you speaking on minimizing the impact. Is it possible to mitigate future climate change? Dr. Shah?
Right, Haja Mazina, to be brutally honest, there are these are irreversible effects of climate change. There are a lot of the changes that have occurred
Mm-hmm.
are irreversible. The reality is that heat has remained trapped in the atmosphere since the start of the first industrial revolution in the 18th century. And
Mm-hmm.
most of the changes to the climate, such as the rise in the sea level, these are set in motion by our own doing. And according to the IPCC, these changes are irreversible. And uh, to be honest, this actually reminds me of a very famous verse in the Quran, verse 41 of Surah Ar-Rum, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, mischief has appeared on land and sea because of the meat that the hands of men have earned, that God may give them a taste of some of their deeds in order that they may turn back from evil. So what's happening today basically for me reminds myself of this particular verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned that much of the destruction is our own doing. Now, having said that, there are things that may be irreversible. IPCC is also confident that if the global community can give their very full commitment to reduce greenhouse gases, especially its emissions, we may be able to mitigate the situation by limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at worst kept at 2 degrees Celsius. But the reality is, even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, it does not mean that it will be a cooler Earth. There will be more heat waves and longer warm seasons with shorter cool seasons. At best, as I've mentioned a number of times, I've been using the word mitigation. At best, that we can do is to mitigate the condition from getting worse. That is the best hope that we have. But to realize this hope, it requires collaborative efforts from everyone, from the government to the industry, to the community, and also to the individual. And this is the challenge that we are facing today, to get everybody on board to mitigate the climate change situation, and also to realize that we are indeed facing a very dire future if we don't do anything. I know there are people that say that climate change is a myth, but I think when we are faced with all the scientific data presented by the report, it is difficult to say or to deny that climate change is really happening. The challenge is for us to actually do something that can minimize the effects of the changes in the climate.
Right, inshallah. Truth hurts, isn't it? Anyway, at the
Yes.
end of October this year, the Glasgow Climate Change Conference will be organized. What do you think? What can we expect to happen there?
Right. Some people are quite cynical in that they say that this is going to be another talk shop where people gather
Mm.
just to talk and talk and talk and nothing happens. But in reality, we have high hopes for this particular conference. The 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26, as you mentioned, will be held in Glasgow,
Mm-hmm.
Scotland, between 31st of October to 12th November 2021. They'll be gathering for about 2 weeks. And COP26 summit in Glasgow will bring parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And they've actually set a number of goals to achieve for COP26 in Glasgow. The first is to secure global net zero emissions by 2050 and keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. Secondly, to adapt to protect communities and restore ecosystems affected by climate change. The third goal is to mobilize finance to achieve the first two goals. At least, it is estimated at least annually, we need about US $100 billion in climate financing. So that's a huge number. So definitely they need to
Okay.
mobilize the finance from especially the rich and developed countries.
Mm-hmm.
And the fourth goal is to emphasize on working together to deliver the goals of achieving uh, or to mitigate the changes brought forth by climate change. Again, uh, these four goals are very lofty, and they may, to some people may actually say that they are unrealistic. But at least the goals are set. Now the challenge is for the parties who confer during COP26 for them to negotiate and try to put something in action that can bring about the much needed change that we want to see with regards to the climate.
Right. But Doctor, what action should be taken at the national level to mitigate climate change?
I think at the national level, there are two levels that we have to think
Mm,
about. The first is at the governmental level. I think
yeah.
in terms of policies,
Mm-hmm.
Malaysia's priority is to plan for a more resilient and sustainable socio-economic strategy vis-a-vis climate change. Even though Malaysia is not a major emitter of greenhouse gases, we only produce less than 1% of the total global emission. The reality is that even while we do not produce much, the existing greenhouse gas emissions at the global level in the atmosphere already has an impact, including to our country. Therefore, I think Malaysia needs to enhance mitigation measures consistent with the Paris Agreement by putting in place policies that are climate resilient, as I mentioned earlier. That is at the governmental level. And this has to be translated into actions, implementation, as well as cooperation from all parties involved, including the industries. Now, at the individual level, if you recall, in the past few episodes, we have discussed about green practices. So this is something that we can do at our own individual level. We need to inculcate green practices in order to reduce our carbon footprints and
Yes.
consequently contribute towards mitigating climate change. Now, some may say, well, I'm just one person. What change will that bring? But if everybody comes in together, that definitely can give a much desired impact that we want to see with regards to mitigating climate change.
Right. I think it's not a choice anymore. I think everyone has a role to play, in order
True.
to save the earth, inshallah. So, you know, as a conclusion, Dr. Shah, what would you say about this topic, this week's topic, IPCC report on climate change? What does climate change mean for Malaysia?
Right. I think the report is actually an eye opener for those who have
Mm.
seen the report. And I hope that by sharing this information today in today's episode of Man in Nature, it can also be an eye opener for our listeners. As you said, we no longer have an option. This is something that we have to do in order to mitigate climate change. This is our responsibility. And, if you can't do everything, don't leave everything out. At least try our best to do some of the things with regards to green practices, and hopefully cumulatively what we do can bring about the impact that is desired. This is for the sake of our future generation as well, of our children and grandchildren. If we don't do anything, then we are putting their lives at risk. And
Yeah.
if we were in their shoes in the future, they might look back and blame the earlier generation for the predicament that they'll be in. So I think
Yes.
this is our responsibility, and this is something that we have to put into action, not just
Yeah.
say or speak, but also to translate what we say into action, so that
Mm-hmm.
the benefit can be reaped by our future generations, inshallah.
Indeed, true. And it's about doing justice to ourselves and also to our future generations,
True.
inshallah. So, Dr. Shah, thank you very much for sharing with us on this week program, Man and Nature. Inshallah, we'll see you again next week.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. So, thank you very much once again. Stay safe. Assalamualaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.